Nothing ever again. While you were gone, nothing ever again. So today we're going to resume 1984. I'm actually going to cover what I previously covered, a specific chapter. However, I realized after looking at the graphic novel here and this freshly squeezed copy of George Orwell's 1984 that this one's abridged. So I want to read the full chapter in here about war is peace. It's kind of like a history of the world in context of Winston's world in 1984. Yet it is very pertinent to reality or the real world. Hence, it's why it's one of the top books ever sold, written, purchased. Yet, because maybe it is just the inevitability made manifest. Maybe it's just inevitability in print. And that is what has long been resounding with people, especially since this book was written, if you recall, in 1948. Or, before then, but that was when it was published, I think. Orwell died right beforehand. He never got to see the success or how it how people came to understand it and seemingly model off of it even. But what we're going to read is a section from, it's chapter 3, War is Peace, but it's chapter 3 from What Matters is a specific book within this world, and it matters because it's technically the only book in this world, right? Everything is related to the party, and there is no outside literature, there are no books, there are no theories. Remember, the party and Big Brother are humanity, eternal, and God, and they can have no weakness or no contradiction, so you can't have any books, you can't have any literature, um, right? You have to, when you're constantly rewriting history, eventually you won't need to rewrite history because eventually it will have been rewritten, right? And then once you control the past, you control the present and the future because no one knows any better, and because no one has read anything and no one knows history, no one can remember the past and no one can carry it forward or teach it. um, Basically humanity exists cut off in a as a new species, as a newly born species, the creation of a corporation state. So I'm reading this, and I'm reading this again specifically. Like I'm not thinking about the older generations. A lot of people, they got their piece of the pie. They checked out a long time ago, or everyone else. They get so wrapped up in the way things were or the way things have been, and they think it's going to be that way forever, but it never is. And these ones are always caught off guard the worst. And then I'm thinking specifically, not even again my generation and slightly older, because happens all the time that people and their language and their way of life, they're fossils before they even realize it, right? And you better believe it was no different with the people in this world. Um, so I'm thinking specifically about, the ones born not too long ago, the ones born yesterday, the ones that'll be born in the come in the years. Because I was thinking about this, and I was thinking like, yeah, they're basically born in the fallout. But then I was thinking, you know what? I think they actually are the fallout, and they're gonna keep coming. And so it's very relevant that they know how things came to be. So this is called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. Chapter 3, War is Peace. Wink, wink, right? Um, so, war is peace. The splitting up of the world into three great superstates was an event which could be and indeed was foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. With the absorption of Europe by Russia and the British Empire by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were already effectively in being. The third, East Asia, only emerged as a distinct unit after another decade of confused fighting. The frontiers between the three superstates are in some places arbitrary, and in others they fluctuate according to the fortunes of war. But in general they follow geographical lines. Eurasia comprises the whole of the northern part of Europe and Atlantic Asiatic landmass, from Portugal to the Bering Strait. Oceania comprises the Americas, the Atlantic islands, including the British Isles, Australasia, and the southern portion of Africa. East Asia, smaller than the others and with a less definite western frontier, comprises China and the countries to the south of it, the Japanese islands, and a large but fluctuating portion of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so far for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitude toward it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as raping, looting, the slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations to slavery or ash, and reprisals against prisoners which extend even to boiling and burying alive, are looked upon as normal, and when they are committed by one's own side and not by the enemy, meritorious. But in a physical sense, war involves very small numbers of people, mostly in drones, mostly highly trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on the vague frontiers whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at, right? When things happen by helicopter raid, around the floating fortresses which guard strategic posts on the sea lanes. In the centers of civilization, war means no more than a continuous shortage of consumption goods and the occasional crash of a rocket bomb, which may cause a few scores of deaths. War has in fact changed its character. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed their order of importance. Motives which were already present to some small extent in the great wars of the early 20th century have now become dominant and are consciously recognized and acted upon. To understand the nature of present war, for in spite of the regrouping which occurs every few years, it is always the same war. One must realize in the first place that it is impossible for it to be decisive, right? It all serves one end. None of the three superstates could be definitely conquered, even by the other two in combination. They are too evenly matched, and their natural defenses are too formidable. Eurasia is protected by its vast land spaces, Oceania by the width of the Atlantic and the Pacific, East Asia by the fecundity and industriousness of its inhabitants. Secondly, there is no longer, in a material sense, anything to fight about. Right? With the establishment of self-contained economies in which production and consumption are geared to one another, the scramble for markets, which was a main cause of previous wars, has come to an end. While the competition for raw materials is no longer a matter of life and death, period, my bad. In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast that it can contain almost all of the other materials that it needs within its own boundaries. Insofar as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is a war for labor power. Between the frontiers of the superstates, and not permanently in the possession of any of them, there lies a rough quadrilateral with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong, containing within it about a fifth of the population of the earth. It is for the possession of these thickly populated regions and of the northern ice cap that the three powers are constantly struggling. In practice, no one power ever controls the whole of the disputed area. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and it is a chance of seizing this or that fragment by a sudden stroke of treachery that dictates the endless changes of alignment. All of the disputed territories contain valuable minerals, and some of them yield important vegetable products such as rubber, which in colder climates is necessary to synthesize by comparatively expensive methods. But above all, they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. Whichever power controls equatorial Africa or countries of the Middle East or southern India or the Indonesian archipelago disposes also of the bodies of scores of hundreds of millions of ill-paid and hard-working coolies. The inhabitants of these areas, reduced more or less openly to the status of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror, and are expended like so much coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labor power. Yeah, so all you guys over there, if you like get all this and you hear all this and you know all this and you can, I'm not gonna say forgive us, but I don't know, move past us, forget about us, take it, do something more than us. You're probably better than us. So you should try to be better than us. And I mean, just how ultimately simple and singular minded it is. And then from there it's basically perpetual revenge. So to capture more territory, to control more labor power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on indefinitely. It should be noted that the fighting never really moves beyond the edges of the disputed areas. The frontiers of Eurasia flow back and forth between the basin of the Congo and the northern shore of the Mediterranean. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are constantly being captured and recaptured by Oceania or by East Asia. And in Mongolia, the dividing line between Eurasia and East Asia is never stable. Round the pole, all three powers lay claim to enormous territories, which in fact are largely uninhabited and unexplored, but the balance of power always remains roughly even, right? So that's a hilarious detail, real quick, that Orwell put in. This idea that there's this big land up there, and maybe there are resources under the soil. You can assume it's not for nothing, but just the fact that you can imagine someone went up there first and goes, haha, we own this chunk of land, and then everyone else said, okay, we got to do it too, because he's talking about, monkey see, monkey do, right? So they get the nuke, then they get the nuke, right? It didn't take Russia long to steal the information from us. It shows you how secure the nation has always been. But, okay, let's see. Where were we at? Never stable, round the pole, right? Monkey see, monkey do. But the balance of power always remains roughly even, and the territory which forms the heartland of each superstate always remains inviolate. Right? Moreover, the labor of these exploited peoples around the equator is not really necessary to the world's economy. They add nothing to the wealth of the world, since whatever they produced is used for purposes of war, and the object of waging war is always to be in a better position in which to wage another war. By their labor, the slave populations allowed the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not exist, the structure of world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principles of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is to use up the products of the machines without raising the general standard of living. Do you hear that? The purpose is to use up the products of the machines without raising the general standard of living, right? What else is hundreds of years of continuous warfare about? Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so, even if no artificial processes of destruction had been at work, right? It's like, at the end of the day, it's like all these things, the crashes in the past, the crash that's to come, the big one, all this stuff is manufactured, guys. Might as well be another potato famine. The world of today is a bare, hungry, dilapidated place compared with the world that existed before 1914, and still more so if compared with the imaginary future to which the people of that period looked forward, right? They had beliefs. They had beliefs in believing. They had a little bit, I'm not going to say anyone's innocent, but to the degree that a people loves and values and creates a vision and tries to see that through, right? Whether that's an individual and a family or a people and their society and their values, right? And still more so compared in the early 20th century, the vision of a future society unbelievably rich, leisured, orderly, and efficient. No, we needed psychotic, right? We needed psychotic and dingy. A glittering antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow white concrete was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Actually, real quick, this is what esotericists and psychologists and linguist G.I. Gurdjieff once said that what would drive Americans insane, he said it was two things: tall buildings and electricity. And if you can follow the line of thought through, the idea is tall buildings being ungrounded, right? Being cut off, like removed from reality, taken off ground floor, no longer seeing what's in front of you, up in the sky, living somewhere else except here in reality, not being present to reality, let's say, right? So one of the things that would drive Americans insane is tall buildings. The other thing is electricity, right? The buzz and hum, the constant whir and churn, and now the addictive device, right? The addictive application, or just designed to take up all your time, not just through apps and web pages and constant scrolling, but also customer service and hidden fees and calculations and all sorts of just manipulation at the end of the day. So I don't even know. I started ranting in this direction. I don't know if I made my point, but you better believe I meant it. Damn it. And then we were talking about a glittering antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow and white concrete. Oh yeah, the other thing to drive them insane, electricity. So was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at a prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. Nope, that had to blow everything apart. Right? I said it in the last video. How do you keep a family from forming? How do you keep an individual's mind and self from forming? You blow it apart. Constant warfare, constant marketing, constant manipulation, constant propaganda. Um, Science and technology were developing prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. This failed to happen, right? You idealists are crazy. You're delusional. This failed to happen, partly because of the impoverished caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partly because scientific and technical progress depended on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society, an insane society, so rigid that it will break unless you subvert reality, unless you completely remove reality. So, as a whole, the world is more primitive today than it was 50 years ago. Certain backwards areas have advanced, and various devices, always in some way connected with warfare and police espionage, have been developed, but experiment and invention have largely stopped. And the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers inherent in the machines are still there. From the moment the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machines were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. And in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute. The machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. But it was also clear that an all-around increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed, in some sense, the destruction of a hierarchical society, right? Their values, right? This is why I said I'm not concerned with the old people. I'm not concerned with the fossils. They don't realize that they're already extinct. It's everyone who's born into this perpetual warfare. They're the fallout who have to deal with the fallout. Um, in a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an airplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared. Right? And I said I thought this was a capitalist code, meaning their fragile ego, right? This is where I think even part of Big Brother comes from. The fragile ego of the average male or even above average male of this era is still only slightly more evolved ultimately than Neanderthal. You put them together with an organization and they get dumber and slower. And so to create the world that they wanted, they had to put the world in a straitjacket. They had to freeze history at a place and time to say, and no more, right? While you were out, nothing ever again, because we can't have contradictions. So if we were to prove that we could solve all these problems, and this could be a credit to the capitalist ego, right? But see, here's the thing: the whole thing runs on a lot of jealousy and hatred too. So if other people see that, hey, other people having more doesn't make you have less. Hey, like solving problems that are actually easy to solve, like it doesn't take away from your struggle. It doesn't remove anything from you. It doesn't deny you anything. Like the whole fact that the system is contingent on psychos wrapped up in other psycho worlds, you know, believing in the bullshit and the lies and, slaves competing with slaves because that's the viciousness. That's exactly how the society runs. That's how it's taught to run. That's how it's marketed to run, right? It's hatred. It's envy. It's everything channeled towards the corporation state in this case, right? It's not repressive at all. In this world, they let you have your fun. They let you have your thrills. It's just so long as you go with the party lines, we're told, or you exist outside of it and you're not even a concern to anyone. You just don't matter as a human being, right? And not that anyone in the society does either, because there is no such thing as the human being. You know, the human being has gone extinct. Um, anyway, let me keep going here. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possession and luxury, should be evenly distributed. Oh, by the way, I don't consider myself any of these things necessarily, and I don't really, I'm just pointing it out. I can see it myself. I'm just exploring the ideas. I'm not saying, because again, understand why Winston is insane in this world, because he sees the reality of the war machine around him and in front of him, screaming in his face, about to swallow him any day. He's existing with this horror and this depression and this angst in the pit of his stomach. Every day he's dealing with this, right? On the edge of non-existence. Um, so it was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate. This is a theory, right? Would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away, period. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only made possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practical solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world. Oh yeah, give a phone or a book to a child, they'll start swiping on it. And moreover, any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense and was bound to be dominated. Yes, and for an individual in society is no different. They see what everyone else is using, so they're going to hop on the bandwagon too, right? This is just common behavior, especially amongst, prisoner conditions. So become quasi-instinctive, any country which remained bound to be dominated directly or indirectly by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate, land went out of cultivation, capital equipment was not added to, great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by state charity. Uh-oh. Well, we might be going back to that for a bit. But this too entailed military weakness, and since the privations of it inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Let me repeat that again. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Bombs. Bombs, there's your answer, right? Consumer goods. Goods must be produced, but they need not be distributed. A bomb serves that purpose. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, right? Not necessarily of human lives, but of products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking in the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable and hence, and in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed, right? Your children will pay for it with trillions in inflation for years to come. It's hard to imagine that can even stand for long. A floating fortress, for example, has locked up in it the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately, it is scrapped as obsolete, never having brought any material benefit to anybody, and with further enormous labors, another floating fortress is built. In principle, the war effort is always so planned as to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. And if anyone knows here how governments work and committees work and budgets work, right, there's both a need and a pace to increasing it all and spending it all. So, and everyone asking for favors and leeching and parasitizing therein. In practice, the needs of the populations are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life. but this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, right? Got to keep you with that, got to keep the donkey with the carrot and the stick. Because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. See, capitalists are always like this. They just expect you to suck it. So by the standards of the early 20th century, and their socialist counterparts, right? They love the capitalists because that's why they exist. By hiding behind the masses, the socialist gets to say we're more moral, right? We're the better, choose us, right? They're the midwits using the low wits to try to take on the high wits. So it's like they're going to lose, and that's what we see in this story. By the standards, small privilege, this magnifies, yeah. By the standards of the early 20th century, even a member of the inner party lives an austere, laborious kind of life, right? He's a company man. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better textures of his clothes, the better quality of his food and drink and tobacco, his 2 or 3 servants, his private motor car or helicopter, set him in a different world from a member of the outer party, and the members of the outer party have a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horseflesh or bag of onions makes the difference between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consciousness of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival, right? Prisoner conditions. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way, right? Terror. That's what it is, it's terror. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, yes, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. Sure, why not? But this would, it seems like that becomes a sort of unconscious compensation, maybe in riots and looting, but that could all just be, people being people. But this would provide only this economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. What is concerned here is not the morale of the masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they are kept steadily at work, but the morale of the party itself. Even the humblest party member is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent within narrow limits. Good dog. But it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgiastic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the mentality appropriate to a state of war. It does not matter whether the war is actually happening, and since no decisive victory is possible, it does not matter whether the war is going well or badly. All that is needed is that a state of war should exist. The splitting of the intelligence which the party requires of its members, and which is more easily achieved in an atmosphere of war, is now almost universal. But the higher up the ranks one goes, the more marked it becomes. It is precisely in the inner party that the war hysteria and hatred of the enemies are the strongest. Right? They believe it. They're into it. You have to be. In his capacity as an administrator, you feed off it. It is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, that he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious and is either not happening or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party member wavers for an instant in his mystical belief that the war is real and is bound to end victoriously, with Oceania undisputed masters of the entire world. All members of the inner party believe in this coming conquest as an article of faith. It is to be achieved either by gradually acquiring more and more territory, and so building up an overwhelming preponderance of power, or by the discovery of some new and unanswerable weapon. What's it called? Not HAL 9000, the predecessor. I have no mouth and I must scream. I think, therefore I am. That one. Maybe we'll get there. Is to be achieved either by, weapon, or discovery of some new unanswerable weapon. The search for new weapons continues unceasingly, and is one of the few remaining activities in which the inventive or speculative type of mind can find any outlet. In Oceania, right, or in modern context, you could say scientists generally either work for the war machine or they work for Kellogg's, right? The most brilliant minds in the world, and they got to work for the corporation state. Good luck getting funding or anything else elsewhere, right? In Oceania, at the present day, science in the old sense has almost ceased to exist. In Newspeak, there's no word for science. The empirical method of thought on which all the scientific achievements of the past were founded is opposed to the most fundamental principles of an ingsoc, right? That's the corporation state. And even technological progress only happens when its products can in some way be used for the diminution of human liberty. In all the useful arts, the world is either standing still or going backwards. Backwards, backwards, backwards. The fields are cultivated with horse plows while books are written by machinery. But in matters of vital importance, meaning in effect war and police espionage, the empirical approach is still encouraged or at least tolerated. The two, right? So reality is allowed where it can help you win the war. The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish, but the control for the reality, right? And that's what they call it, reality control, or that's the old speak. I think it comes to be called something else, all right? The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. You hear that? The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. There are therefore two great problems which the party is concerned to solve. One is how to discover against his will what another human being is thinking, and the other is how to kill several hundred million people in a few seconds without giving warning beforehand. Pretty wild, huh? Both are possible and easy, actually. This is actually kind of, when I said in a previous video that I said that, if I recall correctly, Winston's always a few steps behind O'Brien, and there's a reason why. The dramatic irony of this tragedy and of this horror story, why it leans towards O'Brien and why he's such an important character. It's because he's more intelligent than Winston. He is Winston's superior in every sense of the word. And it shows not just in his position, the reality of his position and the reality of Winston's position, both what the civilized side that Winston sees, and also the fanatic that he sees, especially in Room 101 and in the other torture chambers. But we're talking about the elimination of independent thought, and the joke of it all is that Winston is convinced that the party has yet to figure out how and what other people think. Yet the dramatic irony of the story that O'Brien is there luring him and directing him all along tells you that the party indeed knows how to read what other people think, or at the very least knows how to direct them. And he really demonstrates that power by the time he's in room, again, 101 and the other torture chambers. And you see where O'Brien's cognition and intelligence is at, and then you see that, oh shoot, Winston's still pretty naive. He still doesn't get it, right? That's why he's in his position, right? That's why he's insane. And why Big Brother is right, right? So, insofar as scientific, without giving warning, okay, kill everyone. Gotta kill independent thought and kill everyone. The scientist of today is either a mixture of psychologist and inquisitor, studying with extraordinary minuteness meanings of facial expressions, gestures, and tones of voices, and testing the truth, producing effects of drugs, shock therapy, hypnosis, physical torture, or he's a chemist, physicist, or biologist concerned only with such branches of a special subject as are relevant to the taking of life, or they work at Kellogg's. In the vast laboratory of the Ministry of Peace and the experimental stations in the Brazilian rainforest or in the Australian desert, or on, I wonder if they mean Australasian, or on lost islands of the Antarctic, the teams of experts are indefatigably at work. Some are concerned simply with planning the logistics of future wars. Others devise larger and larger rocket bombs, more and more powerful explosives, and more impenetrable armor plating. Others search for new and deadlier gases, or for soluble poisons capable of being produced in such quantities as to destroy the vegetation of whole continents, or for breeds of disease germs immunized against all possible antibodies. Right, real psychos. And the crazy thing is, if there's any question as to why the school system, for instance, is the way it is, just stepping into reality for a second here, I hope everyone sees why, where the money goes, why the money goes there, why the money doesn't go. Like, intelligence was never the goal. What you needed was, factory workers trained by a bell, conditioned to salivate for money, chasing paper money like a donkey on a stick, right? The paper's not even worth gold anymore. It's not even worth anything anymore. Um, and, it's just it's the way it kind of came to be. Um, Others strive to produce a vehicle that shall bore its way to the soil like a submarine under the water, or an airplane is independent of its base as a sailing ship. Others explore even remoter possibilities, such as focusing the sun's rays through lenses suspended thousands of kilometers away in space. Real quick, was he talking about drones? Airplane is independent of its base as a sailing ship? Huh, okay. That makes sense, kind of. Or producing artificial earthquakes and tidal waves by tapping at the heat of the Earth's center, right? Real mad scientist stuff. But none of these projects ever comes anywhere near realization, and none of the three superstates ever gains a significant lead on the others. What is more remarkable is that all three powers already possess is the atomic bomb, a weapon far more powerful than any of their present researchers are likely to discover. Although the party, according to its habit, claims the invention for itself, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s and were first used on large scale about 10 years later. At that time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped of industrial centers, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe, and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organized society and hence of their own power. Thereafter, that'll teach you, right? Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no more bombs were dropped. All three powers. So, like, one timeline diverges. I'm pretty sure, I'm not familiar. I think it's BattleTech, right? One goes this way, one goes to Big Brother. All three powers merely continue to produce atomic bombs and store them up against decisive opportunity, which they all believe will come sooner or later. And meanwhile, the art of war has remained almost stationary for 30 or 40 years. Helicopters are more used than they were formerly. Bombing planes have been largely superseded by self-propelled projectiles, and the fragile, movable battleship has given way to almost unsinkable floating fortresses. But otherwise, there has been little development. The tank, the submarine, the torpedo, the machine gun, even the rifle and the hand grenade are still in use. In spite of the endless slaughters reported in the press and on telescreens, the desperate battles of earlier wars in which thousands or even millions of men were often killed in a few weeks has never been repeated, i.e., they're not wrong. The butcher fields, the butchering grounds of World War One, the butcher grounds of World War One and World War Two. We haven't seen anything of that scale, but that's partially because nuclear warfare changed that. You can't have large formations of troops. That doesn't mean anything anymore because one, it's a signal of invasion. Two, it's just anyway. In a few weeks have never been repeated. None of the three superstates ever attempts any maneuver which involves a risk of serious defeat. When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack against an ally. The strategy that all three powers are following or pretend for themselves that they are following is the same. The plan is a combination of fighting, bargaining, and well-timed strokes of treachery to acquire a ring of bases completely encircling one or another of their rival states, and then to sign a pact of friendship with that rival and remain on peaceful terms for so many years and to lull suspicion to sleep. During this time, rockets loaded with atomic bombs can be assembled at all strategic spots, right, real life. Finally, they will be all fired simultaneously with effects so devastating as to make retaliation impossible. It will then be time to sign a pact of friendship with the remaining world power in preparation for another attack. This scheme, it is hardly necessary to say, is a mere daydream, impossible of realization. Moreover, no fighting ever occurs except at the disputed areas around the equator and the pole. No invasion of enemy territory is ever undertaken, right, the heartlands. This explains the fact that in some places the frontiers between the superstates are arbitrary. Eurasia, for example, could easily conquer the British Isles, which are geographically part of Europe, or on the other hand, it would be possible for Oceania to push its frontiers to the Rhine or even to the Vistula, but this would violate the principle followed by all sides, though never formulated, of cultural integrity. If Oceania were to conquer the areas that were used once to be known as France and Germany, it would be necessary either to exterminate the inhabitants, a task of great physical difficulty, right? It's like everyone's replaceable, everything's destructible, it's just a matter of convenience. Or to assimilate a population of about 100 million people who, so far as technical development goes, are roughly on the oceanic level. problem is the same of all three superstates. It is absolutely necessary to their structure that there should be no contact with foreigners except to a limited extent with war prisoners and colored slaves. Even the official ally of the moment is always regarded with the darkest suspicion. War prisoners apart, the average citizens of Oceania never sets eyes on a citizen of either Eurasia or East Asia, and he is forbidden the knowledge of foreign languages. Right? You got to speak our language of good and evil. Theirs doesn't make any sense because they're evil. If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself, and that most of what he has been told about them is lies. The sealed world in which he lived would be, right, most people do live in small self-referential worlds. Most people don't know that many people. Most people, right? And the fear, hatred, and self-realization on which his morale depends might evaporate. It is therefore realized on all sides that however often Persia or Egypt or Java or Ceylon may change hands, the main frontiers must never be crossed by anything except bombs. That's the spirit. Under this lies a fact never mentioned aloud, but tacitly understood and acted upon, namely that the conditions of life in all three superstates are very much the same. In Oceania, the prevailing philosophy is called Ingsoc. In Eurasia, it is called Neo-Bolshevism. And in East Asia, it is called by the Chinese name, usually translated as death worship, perhaps better rendered as obliteration of the self. Right? So all of them share that in common. It's obliteration of the self. There is no you. There is no you that doesn't matter. There is no you that doesn't exist outside the state. And if you exist in the state, that means all of your emotional energy must be channeled. See, they let you have feeling, but the human abyss of it is that the feeling is all wrong. And the feeling is terror, fear, hatred, horror, revenge, eternal revenge on the human spirit and the human body and the human mind. The citizen of Oceania is not allowed to know anything of the tenets of the other two philosophies, but he is taught to execrate them as barbarous outrages upon the morality and common sense, right? Bar, right? They're talking a bunch of nonsense. Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and the social systems which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramidal structure, the same worship of a semi-divine leader, the same economy existed by and continuous warfare. It follows that the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, it's a lot of work. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop one another up, the little like three sheaves of corn. And as usual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they are doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, and they also know what is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. Right? It's like basically planning for failure, but you just don't let it happen. Meanwhile, the fact that there is no danger of conquest makes possible the denial of reality, which is a special feature of Ingsoc and its rival systems of thought. Here it is necessary to repeat what has been said earlier, that by becoming continuous war has fundamentally changed its character. It's like the lengthening of the holidays. A few months out from October here, already seeing Halloween stuff pop up on the shelves, right? And it's August 1st. Uh, changes character. In past ages, a war, almost by definition, was something that sooner or later came to an end, usually an unmistakable victory or defeat. In the past, also, war was one of the main instruments of which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. All rulers of all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency. So long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable, the precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5, but when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. Newspaper and history books were, of course, always colored and biased, but falsification of the kind that is practiced today would have been impossible. Fake news. War was a sure safeguard of sanity, and so far as the ruling classes were concerned, it was probably the most important of all safeguards. While wars could be won or lost, no ruling class could be completely irresponsible. Well, we sure showed them, yes. But when war becomes literally continuous, it also ceases to be dangerous. When war is, you can sleep your way through it. When war is continuous, there is no such thing as military necessity. Technical progress can cease, and the most palpable facts can be denied or disregarded. Right? Think of Vietnam. As we have seen, researches that could be called scientific are still carried out for the purposes of war, but they're essentially a kind of daydreaming, and their failure to show results is not important. Right? It's like string theory. It's a useful place to defer cognition. Efficiency, even military efficiency, is no longer needed. Nothing is efficient in Oceania except the thought police. Funny, the other part of the book he talks about committees, right? Since each of the three superstates is unconquerable, each is in effect, each is in effect a separate universe within which almost any perversion of thought can be safely practiced. Right, just worlds removed and easily blown apart and kept distant. Reality only exerts its pressure through the needs of everyday life, the need to eat and drink, to get shelter and clothing, to avoid swallowing poison or stepping out of top-story windows, and the like. Between life and death, and between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact with the outer world and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space who has no way of knowing which direction is up and which is down. Black is white, fat is beautiful, ugly is stupid, or stupid is smart, smart is stupid, right? All that stuff goes. The rulers of such a state are absolute, as the pharaohs or the Caesars could not be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient or noticeable, and they are obliged to remain at the same low level of military technique as their rivals, but once minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose. I wonder if maybe 20, what if 10, 25, 50%, what if large populations of a country like America start becoming homeless? What do you think anyone will notice anything then? Do you think reality will anyway, the war must continue. The war, therefore, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, is merely an imposture, right? Just like its leaders, right? They don't have to be real leaders. They don't have to be decisive. They don't have to be worried about winning. Just like in American reality, a lot of our fake leaders can fail upwards even. It is like the battle between certain ruminant animals whose horns are set at such an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. Oh, great. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It eats up the surplus of consumable goods and helps to preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. War, it will be seen, is not a purely eternal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interests and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquest of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact, right? It's pressure. It's downward pressure. Shit rolls downhill, right? The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. It would probably be accurate to say that by becoming continuous war, but that by becoming continuous, war has ceased to exist, or ceased to be real to people. The peculiar pressure that it exerted on human beings between the Neolithic age and the early 20th century has disappeared and has been replaced by something quite different. The effect would be much the same if three superstates, instead of fighting one another, should agree to live in a perpetual peace, each inviolate within its own boundaries. For in the case, each would still be a self-contained universe, freed forever from the sobering influence of external danger. A peace that was truly permanent would be the same as a permanent war. This, although the vast majority of party members understood it only in a shallower sense, is the inner meaning of the party slogan, "War is peace." All right, so did you get all that? Class, are you paying attention? Those born recently, those born yesterday, those born today and tomorrow, did you catch all that? This is from George Orwell's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein, technically by O'Brien, right? Technically a trap for dummies who bought the lie that, the revolution will be televised, that the proles are going to rise up, that something, Krusty's finally going to be here someday. Well, I'm letting you know, while you are out, while you continue to be out, the fallout's going to keep coming. But other than that, nothing ever again. Thanks for listening. Thanks for checking out the channel. A lot more to come. We'll see you later.